following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today is part one of our two-part look back on the guests and stories that shaped the podcast in 2022. During this episode, you will hear excerpts from episodes 47 through 72. We'll be back with new episodes of the podcast to start the new year. Until then, please enjoy listening to part one of the very best of 2022.
Episode 47.
From episode 47, here's Craig Tutterow and Ricky Esclapon, data scientists at Edge and Node, talking about what attracted them to move into Web3 and begin working on the graph.
So the main thing I would say there is, again, as I mentioned, I'm creating a lot of these kind of data-driven tutorials that use live data. And I was really fascinated by the idea of being able to create this, permanent applications and permanent content. And I think the graph absolutely addresses these concerns. And it's huge because I was actually, as I was building my project, I was running into a lot of issues around APIs that I was using, both becoming deprecated over time, as well as them having all sorts of rules and regulations around them. And being able to use the graph was actually a huge unlock for my project, because I was actually starting to wonder, how am I going to be able to develop the projects that I have in mind? And I was starting to think wow, I kind of need something that works, exactly like the graph does today. And I was honestly amazed that the team had thought of this as a problem, 3-4 years ago at this point. So that was amazing to me. So yeah, I was very impressed by the graph when I first came across it, and really enabled my projects to kind of go in the direction that I ultimately want them to go.
Yeah, so I was interested in developer productivity. And when I was looking at crypto and what's happening here, the developer velocity is it's insane. The speed at which people are innovating and creating new things, and the extent to which things change week to week. And the other amazing thing is we were able to scale to this level with, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people building over a winter when everyone was kind of very skeptical that this would ever work. And, now we're scaling to millions of users and seeing this sort of influx of developers and development activity. And the only way I can make sense of that is there is something to the technology, to having a world readable, world writable, append-only database that everyone has access to, with standards around open source code. Yeah, I feel like it's a productivity multiplier in ways that we haven't really seen in a long time. And we're also seeing a lot of experimentation around organization, how people are coordinating with each other in DAOs. And one of the problems, macroeconomic problems, has been the great stagnation. So even though we've had all this innovation in terms of digital tooling, digital transformation, we haven't seen that show up in the productivity statistics. And kind of one of my theories around that is that, while the tools might be better, the way we organize ourselves is the exact same as it was 100, 150 years ago. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in terms of corporate governance and organization. And so we're starting to see that now. And that is very exciting. And I feel like that will lead to some improvements in terms of productivity. So I think there is some sort of unlock that's happening here. And the graph is enabling that by making the data usable and queryable, because otherwise it would be very difficult to access in an efficient way where you could use it in applications.
Yeah, and if I may just add, one thing that really also attracts me about the graph is just the underlying fact that it uses GraphQL, because to what Craig said around all the great points that he just made, I think, traditional APIs really only enable you to create data analysis and, kind of things around data that originate from how the API was designed. So you design an API with specific usage already in mind. versus GraphQL is much more powerful because it allows any user to kind of use the infrastructure to create any kind of analysis and any kind of tooling or whatever around that endpoint versus a traditional API, which again only allows you to do what the developer originally had in mind. So I think that also really attracted me to the graph.
Episode 48.
From episode 48, Simon Emanuel Schmidt, solutions engineer at Edge and Node, talking about when he first became aware of the graph and what drew his interest.
Yeah, that story is actually quite cool. I mean, yeah, as you said, we were early, 2017. It was before the graph existed. And me as a, head of front-end / user experience, for me, it was very important to provide an interface to DeFi. It was one of the first DeFi applications that has the same quality as maybe, a Kraken or a CryptoWatch or whatever was around back then. And to do so, to actually draw a chart of token prices, historical token prices, you need to go through the blockchain and find all events where such trade happened, and then take the information out, store it somewhere in order to display that chart, right? And so we started to play around because we were committed to be fully decentralized, and it was a big problem, a huge task. And so we started to actually build our own indexer in an app that you had to download on your computer, so we could distribute it through IPFS. And then you started that app, and that in the beginning just started to sync, had to go through the blockchain, get all this information out, store it locally in a database in order to display those charts quickly. And it was such a pain. And also we realized this probably works if the protocol is only like a couple of thousand blocks old. But if you look at the longer the protocol was around, the longer it took the app to start to sync and everything. And then I was like, okay, we cannot do this in a decentralized way. What can we do? And actually, more or less, when I had this realization, I saw the graph on Twitter, and I clicked on the website, and I was sold on the first page. I was like, okay, this is it. This is how it should be done. Because they also used GraphQL, and we also used GraphQL. It was clear that time that this is the language for data as a data API. And then the stuff that we did with indexing, they did in a way that it is actually able to be decentralized at some point. And then I reached out and said hey, let's talk. We need to collaborate here because you are actually solving a big problem that we have. And that's also why probably Enzyme now is one of the first protocols that integrated with the graph and in the Wave 1 migration partners, because this relationship started back then.
Episode 49.
Here's David Lettercourt from episode 49, a software developer at Edge and Node, sharing his perspective on how important the graph is for Web3.
I think the graph is, to be very, very modest, is indispensable for something like Web3. And I envision it as the database for Web3, where right now we're very focused on making just the data that's stored on chain itself accessible with GraphNode. And we started with Ethereum. We've recently launched Near. There are other non-Ethereum networks in the works, and I think there's at least around some of them, there's been announcements and somewhat talk. But we're also looking very, very seriously at indexing data that's not directly on chain, data that's stored, say, in IPFS or Arweave, some of the storage networks. And I think with that, the graph will grow into sort of this decentralized database for all the needs that decentralized applications have.
Episode 50.
And now Yuri Goldstein from episode 50, founder at the Guild, the largest open source community in the GraphQL ecosystem, talking about what the Guild brings to the graph as a core dev team.
Yeah, so the graph today already exposes GraphQL and built a very interesting infrastructure to expose GraphQL over blockchain data, which I think is fascinating. And they did a really good job in implementing it. And they chose GraphQL because, in my opinion, it's the best way to expose data and to acquire data today. And we are building some of the most popular libraries around GraphQL, and we've been in that ecosystem for a while, and we're probably the largest open source group in GraphQL today. So for us, looking at that was fascinating. And we started looking at the graph, and from our conversation with the team, we saw that there's a lot of opportunities to improve the GraphQL API that is being exposed from the graph, both like for the consumer side, also the internals of how it's being implemented. We had a lot of ideas to improve there as well, and they have had a lot of ideas, and they need also like very experienced people to work on it, because the work that the graph has been doing is really high level. So also, I think there's not, I guess for them, there wasn't a lot of people that could just jump in and work on these things. And for us, it was both very fascinating, and we were capable of jumping in and actually being productive from almost the first day. So there's a lot of stuff that we are working on already. Some of them are already done and even shipped. And many, many other things that we are going to improve, both in the implementation, in the API itself, how it is for consumers, and I would say in the whole ecosystem of the graph, because first of all, there's a lot of knowledge that we could bring also for the ecosystem and the users of, how to use GraphQL in the most effective way, learning materials, how to combine even Web3 data with Web2 data, and all kinds of things that I think would be like, we are also like every day we are working with the graph. It's like we have so many ideas and so many more things we want to build. Yeah, we can go to the details. I would love to. I think there's a lot of things coming, but in a higher level, just I guess getting one of the biggest experts in GraphQL in general, which is the Guild, together with what I think is maybe one, if not the most interesting future developer infrastructure ever, which is the graph and what it's doing for Web3. This combination is just mind-blowing for me personally.
Episode 51.
From episode 51, Tushar, co-founder and managing partner at Multicoin Capital, an industry-leading investments firm that focuses exclusively in the crypto and blockchain space. Here, Tushar talks about how important the graph is for the Web3 stack.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, blockchains are a database. They're a very specific kind of database. And they're not useful for many things. They're going to be slower than a traditional database, going to be more expensive, but they provide some very valuable properties in the trust minimization and credible neutrality of that database. And like all databases, you have to be able to read out of the database to make use of it. The problem that exists today for a lot of dApps is that blockchains are not optimized for your ability to read out of them, right? Like if you look at an Ethereum block, it is just a blob, right? If you are trying to query, like, what is the price of this asset on Uniswap today? You can't just query the latest block of Ethereum. You need to look at all of the blocks and maintain the state of that liquidity pool to the current moment. And very importantly, you need to be synced to the very tip of the chain, which in a proof of work Ethereum is like easier to do because it's 15 seconds. But in a proof of stake Ethereum with many different shards or rollups, or in higher throughput, faster systems like Solana, it's hard to stay synced to the tip of the chain, right? Like you're not necessarily going to stay synced to the tip of every chain. Off your home computer? Probably not. Off your mobile? Definitely not. So you need to find a way to query the databases in a scalable, trust minimized, and secure way in order to be able to use Web3. Otherwise, it's not useful if you can only write to it.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. In just a few weeks, the GRTiQ podcast will celebrate the release of its 100th episode. We're working hard to make sure that the 100th episode is something very special, and you're gonna love it. And it's a huge milestone for us, so we want to celebrate it with those who made it possible. You and all the other listeners who tune in each week to meet the people and hear the stories of those helping to build Web3 and the graph. Listeners who visit grtiq.com/100, that's /100, can record and upload a message that we'll play during the 100th episode celebration. This is our chance to shine a light on you and your story. So if you have something to share about how this podcast or one of the guest stories has impacted you, then we'd love to hear from you. Simply visit grtiq.com/100, that's grtiq.com/100, and upload your message today. Not only will we feature your message during the 100th episode, but you'll also receive a special PO-op. So upload your message today. Visit grtiq.com/100, that's 100, and upload your message today. Let's hear your story and share it with the world.
Episode 52.
Here's Sam, co-founder of Journal de Coin, from episode 52, describing how useful the graph is for those building in Web3, like Sam and his team.
Crazy, it was just about the blue coin, and then you start reading the papers about how Brandon Ramirez planned a while ago to make this thing that was existing on a centralized stack, to make it mutate into a fully fledged decentralized network that is sustainable, with interactions between buyers and sellers and actors involved in the network that makes sense and could fuel it over the years to come. I mean, you still have to take time reading some. I mean, when you read the papers of the graph, not being tech savvy, it's not that easy sometimes to figure out what this is all about. But if you take a deep dive, you really reset your RAM and you start to absorb what it is all about and how it's being built. And it's just not only that blue token. And you see that there are other protocols that have similar ambitions and that could potentially make developer experience so much better. I think it's hard not to fall in love with what the graph does. And I think that, the result is here now. I mean, there is no indexation solution that's spread across multiple chains. Even though it's on Ethereum mainnet, it's fully decentralized, but it's also being deployed on other networks. I think at Cosmoverse, Figment announced that they're working on making it available on Cosmos. It's coming everywhere. Near Protocol, IPFS, it's there. And it's decentralized on Ethereum. I mean, the competition is I think not close to that stage. I mean, what has been achieved is huge. And how well it fastens up the development of applications is just crazy. So to me the initiative, the tech is just impressive. It's more than the blue token I was describing, but you need to really stick to that paper and read how it's being built, and that takes time. Attention times and attention spans are super short nowadays. God, you really have to stick to it.
Episode 53.
And now Baptiste Grave from episode 53, founder of Orbis, a decentralized version of Twitter built on Ceramic and Arweave, and former project manager at Edge and Node, talking about his experience moving from a user to a builder working within the graph ecosystem.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. There were a lot of colleagues who are actually people that built on the graph before joining Edge and Node. And I feel when you start using the graph for the first time, there is something magical in it, right? You have access to all of this data that as a developer is super difficult to get access to, if you want to query a large set of data using just the Web3 packages, it's going to take you a lot of line of codes and it's not going to be performant at all. Whereas with the graph, you can just do one GraphQL query and get access to all of the Uniswap liquidity pools, all of the vaults opened on Maker contracts. And so as a user, you can feel that this experience is something that works super well. And I feel it gets people to want to join the team, right? It's kind of I don't know if maybe 20 years ago, if you would perform a Google search, you would realize that there is something magical with being able to search the entire internet with a few words. And with the graph, instead of being a few words, it's a GraphQL query, but it has something magical in it. And also the team is really amazing, right? When you get to talk with Yaniv, with Brandon and all of the other people, you can feel this motivation and this, energy that I never felt anywhere else as an employee.
Episode 54.
From episode 54, here's Adam Fuller, product manager at Edge & Node, talking about when he first became acquainted with the graph when he was building his own projects in Web3.
Yeah, so I first came across the graph in a hackathon. I applied for a hackathon, built a little thing on a subgraph, and that was the first like my first kind of interaction with it. I was still pretty early in my sort of front end development experience, so like I'm sure if I went back and looked at that app now, it looked pretty gnarly. But it was cool to sort of get a taste and to sort of see some of the data that it made available to me. Like I knew nothing about sort of smart contracts at that time, but I could sort of visualize this protocol. It was basically visualizing streams between different people in a payments network. And then I sort of went away, didn't think about it too much. And like I said, built this app called Nifty Inc. And at the time, I remember when we were talking about it, building it, and we were like, oh, should we build a subgraph? And we were like, no, let's just kind of try and release it. And that's too much overhead for now. Let's just try and do the simplest thing. And so then it was only sort of 2 months later, I think, that the app had become like incredibly heavy and unwieldy, and like was having to pull the node like so much to the RPC node to get the data that it needed. I basically built a subgraph and like refactored everything and got it to work. That I sort of, in doing that, became a sort of graph fanboy in the sense that it made my app so much simpler. I could do stuff that wasn't even possible. And I guess I came to the graph as a user, which I think is really, really cool place to start. And think about where I am now. I've never worked on a product that I've been a user of before. So that was kind of how I guess the other thing that I saw was that in building my subgraph, I came across a bug. And so I reported the bug on Discord, and Leo like solved it in like 12 hours later or something. And I was like, hey, this is cool. These guys move fast. And then they're like responsive to users. So I had this good user experience of building a thing that made my life a lot easier. I had like an interaction where they'd listen to me, a random like developer on Discord. And so then when I saw that Edge & Node were hiring, Edge & Node actually only sort of formed in January of last year. So when I saw they were hiring, I thought it was cool they were hiring a product manager, which is what I did in my day job. And I thought it would be nice to do in the daytime what I was spending evening and weekends working on.
Episode 55.
Here's Craig Burrell, partner at Reciprocal Ventures, a venture capital firm with deep expertise in fintech and crypto, talking about what excites him most about the future of the graph.
I think it's the universal applicability of the graph. So often you look at a company and it has this market that it's going after, and it's very segmented to a specific persona, a specific customer profile. And by the time you whittle down the number of people or the number of businesses that it could be used by, you end up with maybe $1 billion, $2 billion market, something like that. And that's pretty standard when you're going after a venture business, a venture investable opportunity. With the graph, I think it's just orders of magnitude larger than that. It really does have the potential to become this universal data layer above every layer one that ends up being, heavily utilized. And when you put it in that context, I just think there's an incredible long-term opportunity for the vision of the graph.
Episode 56.
During episode 56, we were joined by Jeff Morris, founding partner at Chapter One, a venture capital firm focused on the Web3 economy. Here's Jeff talking about what drove his early interest in supporting the graph.
I think it was this idea that because all data is on chain and you have this environment where you could actually like create really elegant subgraphs of information if you incentivize the community correctly. It just seemed like a very necessary piece of infrastructure that if I was building a product, I would want to use. And even more recently, like we've thought about different products we can build at Chapter One, and like it's not easy to query on-chain data in like a more generalized format. And so it to me like felt like something I would actually use as a builder, which I thought was really telling. And also just even the team, as I mentioned, they have a very decentralized ethos that I thought really to me like felt authentic, and they just felt like the right team to build this.
Episode 57.
From episode 57, the first anniversary episode of the podcast, we welcome back guest number 1, Jim Cousins, to celebrate. Jim is a council member, indexer with Wave 5, and a mentor to many people within the graph ecosystem. Here, Jim talks about his motivation in being a mentor to so many within the graph ecosystem.
I don't think I'm selfless at all. I think I'm as greedy as the next person. It's all about, putting something in and having that reflect back at you, right? That's what it's all about. I'm in a privileged position where I've been in this space for a long time. I can essentially do whatever I want. I can say no or yes to anything I want. So my choice was, at some point during the Graph Mission Control testnet, to commit to a specific protocol, right? Prior to that, I'd spent 10 years as an investor, and I took it very seriously, right? From the very early days as an investor in the space. So what I was trying to do very early on in 2012, 13, is I was trying to diversify my Bitcoin, right? That's all I was trying to do. And I'm quite conservative in terms of risk, right? So I spent nearly a whole decade divesting, investing, Ethereum, Cosmos, Polkadot, and a million other failures, nobody talks about the failures, but, the path to success is paved with failure. And I've got to the point where I could decide that I don't need to worry about external income anymore. I can choose to commit to something fully if I want to. So I chose, given what was reflected back to me from many people, Yaniv, Eva, Martine, indexers, Gary, Payne, all the friends that I made, I decided that, this was something that I really wanted to get involved with because I could see that other people were taking it as seriously as I was. So I see it as my job to give people time when they're serious about trying to do something, and then finding ways to empower them via my own network. And that's really all it comes down to. I'm in a privileged position where I can choose to do that. So that's what I do. It's not about being selfless. It's about bringing more people in that I think can help us succeed in what we're doing. I've learned a lot about that from Yaniv, to be quite honest. Yaniv, it's really his thesis, right, about investing in people and things. It's a risk that you take. And in my experience, it works out more often than it doesn't. So people often talk about that conversation with Yaniv. That's what it was for me. It was, understanding. He understood my thesis. I explained it as I'm on a journey. And I understood his, which was that his way of contributing was to find opportunities and people and then, put resources in the hands of them. And, that really resonates with me. So here I am.
Episode 58.
Here's Vince Patosha, an indexer at The Graph, talking during episode 58 about his new indexer operation Notify and what, as a new indexer, surprised him most after he got started.
Well, initially I thought what would surprise me most is the technical lift that it took and how I got there. But really for me, it was joining the cohort of other indexers. And it's such a diverse group of talented people from all around the world that are really laser focused on the same vision at the end of the day. I think that it's kind of incredible. If you look, indexers are really competitors to each other in a data business at the end of the day. And the altruistic nature of the indexer community has been really astonishing to watch. I'd advise anyone to attend indexer office hours to really see what's going on behind the scenes with that community.
Episode 59.
And now Kathy Barrera, founding economist at Prism Group, from episode 59. Here I asked Kathy, a professional economist, about her perspective of the graph as an economic system.
So the graph to me is, I guess I'm going to sort of start off by how I put the graph into context. When I started in the blockchain space in 2018, it was right after the ICO craze. And there were a lot of projects at that time that were seeking to establish distributed marketplaces between buyers and sellers, where the service being provided in that marketplace was some type of computing service. So computer storage, computer processing, there's any number of these that I'm sure you know many examples of. So to me, the graph is sort of the next generation of this type of marketplace, this type of system. What I think is really interesting about the graph is that the mechanisms that have been designed so far are much more sophisticated than what was seen certainly back in 2018. And I think what we see across some of the competitors. I will say, I think that there's, these are difficult problems to solve. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think that the teams that are working on the graph network and the distributed marketplace are, aware of all of those issues and are working systematically to try to move that market toward more decentralization. I think that is the correct approach, right? I think that whereas historically, there have been examples where folks have just sort of like put out the code and then not much ends up coming of it. I think that the groups that are working on developing the graph are being careful to sort of cultivate this marketplace over time so that it can be sustainable.
Episode 60.
From episode 60, Dan Enright, an indexer at the Graph. Dan's indexer operation is called Blocksteady, and here I asked Dan about what went into the decision for him to make the career move and become an indexer full-time at the Graph.
Yeah, sure. So the decision to have a go at indexing was one that naturally just followed from the mission control program. There was a reward given to participants of some stake that could be used on the network. And so I put that to work. I staked my GRT as an indexer. At this point, I did not even consider, leaving my full-time job to index full-time. I just wanted to see how this went. So I did that. And, there was some delegation that came in initially, which was very encouraging. There was, I think, some other vesting contracts on the network wanted to put their GRT to work, and a lot of us indexers from the mission control program received this delegation. And after a few weeks of indexing, I then started to consider looking at the numbers. So I used a calculator to try and work out how much GRT was I receiving. What if I changed my reward cut parameters to this amount? How would that change what I'm receiving? What if I received further delegation? What if I lost delegation? I'd want to understand the different scenarios that could potentially eventuate. And I was fortunate enough actually to receive a large amount of delegation from a connection that I had in a messaging group here in Australia. And I was very grateful to receive that from a fund here in Australia. They had a lot of GRT that they could distribute, and they used this amongst a couple of indexers on the network, myself being one of them. So I had a good relationship with them. They could see my track record. And after receiving this delegation, after a couple of months of earning rewards, I had enough runway to make the leap into indexing full time. So I was fortunate. I didn't really need to go out and market myself too much. I do now find myself in a position, though, where that delegation has left my indexer, and I've actually assisted that fund in setting up their own indexer. I will look now to see how I can market myself further, but I'm still in a position where I'm receiving enough rewards from the delegation that I have currently to maintain my operation as a full-time venture.
Episode 61.
During episode 61, I asked Raphael Mazet, co-founder and CEO at Simplify, to share how important the graph is for Web3 and dApps.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I've been in the space for a little while, and I remember there was a whole phase where people were talking about open source block explorers, because there is a fundamental challenge in this space to go and retrieve historical data. It's just not easy to do from an archive node. It's very inefficient. It takes a very long time. It's heavy infrastructure, and it's inefficient. So that's why you need indexing solutions. And that's why people were focusing on it at one point. And that's, I think, why the graph evolved from that whole kind of thinking. And something like the graph is very important because it's open and it's flexible, and it allows people to collaborate on standards. We're in a couple of working groups where we're trying to establish, what's the optimal way of building these these subgraphs. What should we include? What should we not include for different use cases, so that we can reuse that technology and stop, reinventing the wheel all the time. I think it's very important. It's very important.
Episode 62.
Here in episode 62 is Kent Forey, co-founder and CTO at GRTiQ, describing how the graph makes life easier for builders like Kent working in Web3.
Well, the first way it makes it way easier is that we're able to build APIs for our smart contracts very, very quickly. This requires a lot of custom work if you're doing it by hand. It requires a lot of skills, which a new developer doesn't have. When a new developer comes to a graph, and you asked me from my perspective, right? So how it solves problems for us as developers in the ecosystem is it makes something very complex quite simple. That is the hosting part of it. People don't have to host their own subgraphs. They can if they want to. You can run your own node and you can host your own subgraph, right? But the hosted network and the decentralized network basically allow developers to iterate way faster. They allow them to create these APIs extremely quickly. I mean, the other day I did a 2-hour session and we created the beginnings of the LooksRare subgraph, right? It's not completed, but in a 2-hour session, I was able to take absolute newbies through the rungs of how to do it, and it doesn't take that long. What it means for the ecosystem is another thing. The possibilities, the applications, we haven't even scratched the surface yet. And I had a lot of great ideas halfway through last year, which I'm only seeing come to fruition now. And I'm happy to see that some people have come to the same conclusions as me on how to use it. I want to one-up them. But I'm also very, very excited about some of the new things coming out, like data edges. That pattern is something that I've been needing for a few of my applications for quite a while. And, cross-chain bridges, using subgraphs as an L2 layer. I've been playing around with ideas for like 8 months about that. So I am extremely excited about what it can do, how you can leverage it. I'm still learning new ways to use it, and fun ways. If you're creative, you can do amazing things with a subgraph. It can turn some work that would usually take you a month into a very, very pleasant 2 days of work, and you feel like you accomplished something amazing because you did. You've basically indexed the smart contract, and it simplifies the process. It's an amazing tool, and the ecosystem around it. And this is just from a developer's perspective. I'm talking from a developer perspective, using it as a tool to create subgraphs, right? Which are these APIs for decentralized applications, right? There's a whole other side. There's the whole economy about curators and indexers and delegators. And I see it as donut-shaped economies. And, they all pay back onto each other. If we have people participating, right? All the protocols, all the EVMs, the graph is going to support them. That helps the graph. If we have indexes playing well and we have curators playing well and we have people querying these subgraphs, then the economy thrives. But there's a lot still to be built. We're in the early stages. If anybody knows about the roadmap, the R&D roadmap and the other things coming, it's quite long and quite detailed, and they're working on amazing things. So definitely jump into community calls because they give you a little bit of a window into what's happening at the graph.
Episode 63.
And now Abby Titcomb, head of community and governance and council member at GRTiQ. From episode 63, here Abby talks about how GRTiQ uses the graph.
Yeah, absolutely. So GRTiQ is, a protocol. It's a network powered by a protocol. But the GRTiQ stack is also a network of clients, which are basically code collaboration experiences and apps that are being built by our contributors that allow developers to interact with the GRTiQ network in different ways. And, some of these apps, like our web client, uses the graph to query data relating to GRTiQ identities and our Ethereum integration. So we have a feature called GRTiQ orgs, which are basically sets of repositories that can be governed by a multi-sig and thus Ethereum identities. And so what's cool about GRTiQ is that you can actually link your Ethereum address to your local GRTiQ identity, which is a key pair. which represents your, unique identity on the device that you're using to write your code. And so we use the graph to query this data and present it through our web client, which gives us the ability to, have a similar experience to GitHub or other centralized platforms that just query their own servers. And so it's a really powerful technology that definitely increases the usability of our code collaboration experiences and allows us to build out all these exciting new code collaboration features.
Episode 64.
From episode 64, Cami Ramos Garzon. Cami's a former dev rel at Edge and Node. Here, she answers the question of what is the best way for devs to get started in Web3.
I would say the best way, and this is not a shill, but it's true, this is how I got started in Web3, is the graph, because you don't have to learn a new programming language. I think a lot of people think, I have to learn Solidity if they kind of go down that route. And you can go down that route, but it is like a longer route to even get kind of your first level of satisfaction. Whereas with the graph, if you know JavaScript and you know GraphQL, which if you're a Web 2 developer, you probably do, or you know something similar enough where you can kind of catch on a little bit easier, you don't have to learn a new programming language, and you can start playing with data from the blockchain and just kind of smacking on a front end, and you're building in Web3. That's Web3. You're getting your data in a decentralized manner. You're indexing your data in a decentralized manner. And that's really one of the easiest ways, I think. And then to kind of take that a step further, it's really helpful to just be involved in the developer community, especially on Twitter, because then you'll just start discovering these protocols that do cool things that you can be like, okay, I can just literally add like 10 lines of code and now I have this feature from this decentralized protocol.
Episode 65.
Here's Vanessa Groulet in episode 65, managing partner at Ogley Ventures, talking about where she thinks the investment opportunities in Web3 are.
So I think in Web3 infrastructure, everything needs to be built. So I think there's a lot of really exciting opportunities to decentralize the entire stack. The graph, of course, is obviously a key enabler in that space. But I think, data, storage, compute are still things where there's like initial, first movers, but that doesn't mean that there can't be several players in the space. There's a lot of excitement around more staking infrastructure and things like that, which are really interesting to us. Identity and then those key components. But those are really hard problems. So you really need to have like a long-term vision in order to succeed there. I think another exciting area that we see is CeFi and DeFi, and anything that, helps drive the adoption of DeFi, whether it be security, whether it be, just tools for consumers to access DeFi, etc. I think that will be really interesting. And other primitives like insurance that, gives comfort for mainstream adoption. And then on the creator economy side, I think there's a lot of excitement around NFTs, and everyone is building an NFT marketplace and an NFT studio. So we see a lot of projects that are, more geared towards Web 2 and consumers rather than core Web3 infrastructure. And I think that's what we're interested in, whether it be financialization of NFTs or the expansion of the type of NFTs that are available right now. We see collectibles, we see art, but NFTs could be anything. And so finding new ways to leverage non-fungible tokens in financial services or real estate or others, I think is interesting to us.
Episode 66.
From episode 66, Aya Kantorovich, head of institutional coverage at Falcon X, talking about the relationship between DeFi, crypto, and the role the graph played early on.
Sure. I would say, finance and crypto at large, and especially decentralization at large, was driven by DeFi. So DeFi was a huge use case for decentralization of crypto for a number of reasons. And the graph was able to find impeccable opportunity of pain points for creating more accessibility. And what I mean by that is, in the same way, so when you have decentralized applications, because in order for them to be fully decentralized, there needs to be some in-source input of data that is trustworthy at a constant flow in order for the application to run seamlessly. And so one form of that is through oracles. And so you've seen a number of oracles like Chainlink who will send, a good example of that, they'll send data in order for these applications to run. Why is that important? Let's say you and I, we enter into a bet where tomorrow, if the sky is blue, you pay me $10. And if the sky is red, pay you $10. But in order for that to happen in a decentralized way, the oracle needs to tell us tomorrow at a specific time what the color of the sky is. And if that oracle is false, then none of the application can run in a decentralized manner. So very similarly, what the graph does that across data, across a number of different blockchains in an accessible way so that these applications can run in a decentralized manner. And so that's really, really important. It's one of those core features that I talked about for the maturation of the space. It's an infrastructure pillar where it's both difficult to understand because you don't see that happening when you log into Google or you're logging into a website, but it's inherent in terms of what it's doing on the back end at a global scale across millions of pieces of data across these different blockchains. And again, what I think is really important is that the graph made it very cool to, fully decentralize, needing to have that cryptography background in order to build some of these applications. And it was really one of the first that did that at scale in order for these applications to run. And I'm sure, there are a number of people within DeFi who can attest to this, but it made building in DeFi incredibly more seamless than it was prior to the graph launching its applications.
Episode 67.
And now here's Connor Dunham, co-founder at Soulbound Labs, answering the question of how important the graph is to Soulbound Labs from episode 67.
Yeah, good question. So the graph is kind of a prerequisite for Soulbound Labs. We wouldn't exist without the graph. That initial idea of awarding people for holding Ether during a bear market, that was all that came about because I was interested in subgraph development and I knew that was possible. So yeah, it overlaps quite a lot. We aren't trying to solve the same problems. It's more like we are using the graph as infrastructure for the reputation system that we're building. I think that's a good way to frame it.
Episode 68.
From episode 68, Spencer Graham, product manager at DAO House, talking about how DAO House uses the graph.
Yes, basically, I would say 90% of the data that you see if you go into the DAO House app is coming from the graph or from one of our multiple subgraphs. We have subgraphs, or we could kind of call it our super graph, which is a bunch of different subgraphs kind of composed together for when you launch or summon a DAO, for when you're creating proposals or voting on proposals, for when you are using side vaults, for all of that stuff. And then we also have another subgraph that is focused on kind of the add-ins or plugins that we call boosts that kind of ties all the data together. And we love that because we don't want to, we want to maintain as little infrastructure and servers as we possibly can. We still use one kind of Web 2-ish API and then server for some of the data that we've not yet figured out how to push to the edges, so to speak. But the graph is a huge reason that we can operate at the sort of low overhead level that we can operate at.
Episode 69.
And now episode 69, when Esteban Ordano, co-founder of Decentraland, answered the question of how important the graph is to Decentraland.
The graph is so important to Decentraland that I think it will be harder to recover from the graph like suddenly disappearing, which when we get to the full decentralization stage, we are going to be safe from that. I think that the Decentraland Foundation can like cease to exist right now, and the Decentraland will continue to work. But some of the servers that are being run by Edge and Node and Edge, are a bigger centralization point of failure than the Decentraland team itself. So it's super critical and super important for the Decentraland. I'm really looking forward for the decentralization of that. But it's so great that the graph source code is open, that anyone can run a node. We're looking into having every catalyst. That's the name that we have for the Decentraland content servers. Like anyone who runs a catalyst we're exploring the idea of they also running a graph node, so that we start to decentralize and improve the resilience of the system.
Episode 70.
Here's Vijay Sundram, co-founder and CEO at Luda. Vijay has vast experience working in Web 2, so I asked him if Web 3 was an inevitability or just an experiment.
Oh, I love that question. Well, yeah, I don't want to get too cute with the answer, but some of this is, what exactly is Web 3? And I think the way I look at it is we're all imagining how we aspire to change the world, and Web 3 is kind of being shaped to do that. And so I think it's a little more interesting to almost talk about what does that change, that I think has probably galvanized people in this ecosystem. At least for me, it's very much about putting more power back into people's hands, socially, creatively, economically, like we talked about. Can we get to 100% decentralization? I don't know. But even if there's a bit more ownership and empowerment in people's hands and we don't get to 100%, there's still enough to make a dent. And so in that sense, is that future we want inevitability? I think yes. Do the building blocks we have today, literally like in their current form or in some variation or some new one come around? That's, I think, an experiment for sure. And some of those experiments are further along than others. The other thing that's really interesting to me about this ecosystem that I talk about with others is part of what's happening with Web3 or what we consider Web3 is a technology and economics shift. And that is, I think, where there is a lot of experimentation happening about, different types of business models and tokenomics and different technical primitives. But then a big part of this shift that I've observed is also philosophical and cultural. And the philosophical and cultural pieces to me also, again, feel like a bit inevitable, even if the technological and the economic primitives are experimental. And it's because you're seeing people who are simply bringing a different value system to projects that don't depend on technology or economics, right? If you look at a project like Ethereum, where such a tiny fraction of the Ethereum token base went to the early founders. That's not a technology or economics decision. That's simply a philosophical and values-based decision. And more and more projects, I think, that take the mindset of publicly owned protocols and public goods and think about the community as a way to grow the pie so that even if they take a smaller portion than they might have if they were a company, they now actually have a much larger community, a much better off community. So I think that aspect to Web3 is also very special, enduring quality to its ethos, which is hard to see a lot of times in a lot of the day-to-day noise that we're in. And so I'd also make that separation between what aspects of the experiment we're running here really are subject to change. Maybe the technology economic side of it does, but the philosophical, cultural kind of roots to a lot of this stuff to me feel really powerful.
Episode 71.
Sam Williams, founder and CEO at Arweave, joined the podcast for episode 71. Here's Sam talking about the news from Graph Day when the integration between Arweave and the Graph was announced.
Yeah, so we're very excited to see that the Graph is now integrated to Arweave so that you can query for information stored inside Arweave via the Graph, which is a really important thing for Arweave because it, as well as being a sort of data storage system, each item of information in Arweave is a sort of rich, if you will, document. So it's not just the data, it's a set of arbitrary tags that the user can set, as well as, the person that uploaded it, the time they uploaded it. And those tags are a really, really important part of our ecosystem. When you're doing something like building a decentralized Twitter on top of Arweave, you would use those tags to say, hey, the app name is, dTwitter, And the type of this transaction is a post. And then when a piece of software that renders the website to the user tries to find all of those posts, it will ask something like the graph now, thankfully, hey, can you give me all of the posts from this, user ID, which is really just their wallet address, with the app name, dTwitter, and the type post. And then it will get back a list of all those posts. And with this system, it's really the missing piece to building fully decentralized web applications on top of Arweave. So we are extremely excited about this.
Episode 72.
Episode 72 was a GRTiQ first, recorded live at GrapHack in 2022. Here, I interview Yondan Fu, co-founder and director of engineering at LivePeer, and Sebastian Siemsen, co-founder and CTO at Enzyme Finance. Both are members of the Graph Council. At this part of the interview, I asked them each to explain how each of their dApps uses the graph.
Yeah, so LivePeer is a decentralized video streaming network, and one of the important components of that network is we have this community of node operators, and in order to provide service on the network, quite similar to the graph, they need to stake the native token for the network, and there's also the ability for delegators to delegate their staked LPT, the native token, to different nodes or orchestrators, which is what we call them on our network. And this is sort of a quality assurance type role where you can help filter out which orchestrators are performing well and which orchestrators are not performing as well. And we have this staking application, which actually plays an integral role because delegators are using this application in order to understand performance and in order to select the top performing orchestrators. And the way that we use the graph is that we have a LivePeer subgraph that indexes all the information, all the staking information from our contracts deployed on chain. And that's used to source all the data that's required to make these decisions. And previous to using the graph, we were a lot more limited in the data that we could surface there, which is problematic because you want these delegators playing this crucial role in the network to have as much rich information as possible. But we were a little bit restricted on what we could access. So the graph was a really useful way to surface all of that so that you could have a more informed experience when making staking decisions.
How about Enzyme? How does Enzyme use the graph?
Yeah, so Enzyme is a decentralized asset management operating system. And we understand ourselves as an infrastructure for others and ourselves also to build decentralized asset management products and services on top of. And as such, we have to provide a lot of granular data, not only about the current state of the blockchain, but also about historical events that occurred and also historical performances, prices, and so on. I think we are probably one of the bigger subgraphs. Just the unique smart contracts that we index on the Ethereum mainnet are probably about 100 or 120 maybe even at this point. And then we have dynamic data sources for all of the different vaults that are spun up on Enzyme, which is a couple thousand at this point. So there's a lot of complexity in maintaining such a big subgraph. So recently we actually split those up, also because we wanted to reduce the necessity to redeploy certain aspects of our subgraph whenever we add new functionality and features to our product. So we actually operate 5 different subgraphs currently with different purposes. And some of them very generic, some of them more specialized to our concrete application needs. And for the core of our product, we have a single subgraph that indexes all of the information about the individual vaults that are deployed within Enzyme. And that includes their depositors, all of the activity of the depositors, so investments, withdrawals, trading activity, current portfolio, so accounting, and all of that stuff that is relevant for a vault to capture performance metrics over time. So a lot of historical data also. And we actually built our own solution for tracking historical states and tracking historical performances, also including the price points of all of the assets that are within our asset universe, which has proven a challenge. Many different ways, actually.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Best of 2022. Next week, you'll hear part 2, covering episodes 73 through 95. So be sure to tune in next week for a special look back on the ideas and stories that shaped the GRTiQ podcast in 2022.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ podcast.